What's good, YouTube? It's me, everybody. Squid back in another video. Going first, this is not as auto-win as you would expect it to be because, cards like hand traps exist in the game. So what are some good going first cards that you can dedicate to your deck to make sure that you're winning when you win the die roll? Well, here's what you can side. Starting off at the top, we have everyone's favorite card that somehow dodged the ban list. Yes, Anti-Spell Fragrance. This card is literally Imperial Order at 3. I'm not sure why the heck this card is still at 3 copies. Could someone please tell me why this card is at 3 copies? Because this card literally says that your opponent cannot activate spells, and when you back it behind a board, literally any board, it could just be like one monster that has like a negate or like even a Fenrir, can be scary enough because if your opponent is opening up a bunch of spells, they're not going to be able to play. And we all know that after Phantom Nightmare and Maze of Millennia, a lot of the fire decks are going to be playing a lot of spell-based extenders, right? Even Fire King, they have Fire King Sanctuary, Fire King Island. Of course, the Sinful Spoil stuff is all normal spells except for Wanted, so they're not going to be able to use the original Sinful Spoils. Sure, they're going to be able to chain Wanted to go and get a Black Witch, but it doesn't really matter because as long as they're not using their powerful, problematic spell cards like Origino, or even side deck cards, like cards that they're siding in like Tactics or Thrust, then that means you're probably in a great spot. And again, if you go first and your opponent hand traps you a couple of times, the nice thing about decks in this format is it's a very favorable going first metagame after Phantom Nightmare, and I find that like decks are very resilient to hand traps. So even if they get hand trapped a bunch of times, they're still going to be able to put up at least one monster. Like sometimes they're going to be putting up a Promethean Princess anyways. Chuck that bad boy into the graveyard, or the bad girl rather, and then summon an Ambler Whale, and then all of a sudden you're like, okay, I have to deal with the Promethean Princess. You get Ambler Whale. If you're playing against Fire King, they also have the Kirin in hand or at their disposal, the Garunix in the grave as well. And on top of all that, they just set one past. Oh boy, I hope that card set is not what I think it is. Yep, it's anti-spell. Well, guess my hand is just redundant. I'm not going to be able to use Thrust or Talents. I'm not going to be able to use also counter-siding cards like Soul Release, right? We talked about this card. Ooh, can't show that art, or can we? But anyways, we talked about this card being extremely good against Fire Kings, but if people are setting anti-spell fragrance, that's going to be a bit of a problem, right? So this card, in my opinion, is very, very powerful. Next is another continuous spell card that I think is decently good, and that's Summon Limit. This card says neither player can summon more than twice per turn, and for those of you guys that don't know, the ruling is this card starts counting the minute it's on the table, even face down, okay? It starts counting summons, which means the moment your opponent summons twice during the turn, if they're attempting to summon a third time, you can change Summon Limit to the effect of a card that would special summon a third time, and then basically that effect resolves without effect. It fizzles because they've already summoned twice. This card literally counts the moment that it's on the field, even if it's face down. And this card is extremely potent because nowadays a lot of decks are just infinite combo extensions, right? Even decks like Rescue Ace, they're summoning a bunch of monsters off of Emergency. Being able to kind of deal with that with Summon Limit is really, really important. But bear in mind that they can sometimes play around it. Obviously, Emergency is a quick play. So if you flip Summon Limit, they can actually chain Emergency and then summon something out. So a lot of decks kind of have that capacity. As long as they have something like an Emergency Teleport-esque effect, then they're going to be able to chain that to special summon another monster. Same thing with Kirin. If it's in the main phase, they can special summon out the Kirin by popping something. So that could be relevant. Just one thing to know. And then the other thing that I kind of dislike about these continuous trap cards is the fact that Pancratops is now at 2, and this card is absolutely disgusting. We all know that this card was once at 3, once upon a time, and it was very devastating. When you went first and you set some floodgates and your opponent was like, standby phase, main phase, special summon Pancratops, you literally look at your back row like 3 times and you're like, yeah, this sucks. I'm pinned down by Pancratops. That's going to threaten my board by having a 2600 attack. He could attack into things and start threatening, cards like Fenrir that are just on my table. And then on top of all that, they can chain the effect of Pancratops to target my face down cards, or even wait until I flip off a floodgate and deal with it easily, right? So that's kind of my gripe with the continuous trap cards. That being said, I still think they're good. I mean, Pancratops is only at 2 copies, right? And it's not guaranteed everyone's going to play it, even though I personally think you should. Not everyone's going to be like a fan of the dinosaur guy. So they're going to be like, hey, we're going to play other cards instead. We didn't have room for Pancratops, which I think is a mistake. But, people do what they want to do, So at the end of the day, Pancratops is a bit of a problem. And then, another card that I thought might be decently good as Macrocosmos going first, but provided your deck can actually run this. Because obviously you cannot be a very heavy graveyard-based strategy if you're running Macrocosmos, because it kind of like screws you over as well, right? So this card is effective against a lot of decks that rely on the graveyard. Obviously, Fire King is a big one, like Promethean Princess. I feel like all of the decks are going to be playing this. A lot of the top cut, in fact, like top cut will probably be 80 to 90% Promethean Princess decks, because this card is just that good. You guys don't believe me? Wait until the events happen. I swear this card is going to get banned. It's just that good. And if you're playing a deck that can kind of not use a graveyard, I mean like Floowandereeze, maybe Kashtira, then you could definitely set a copy of Macrocosmos and instantly deal with the Fire King. Potentially auto win on the spot, even against decks like Rescue Ace, same sort of deal. Now, unfortunately, again, it's continuous trap, so it suffers from the same problem that we have previously with Pankratops being the wrestler that's going to literally wrestle these continuous trap cards to the graveyard. So that's the annoying part I hate about the continuous trap card floodgates right now, is that Pankratops has been unleashed to deal with them. And honestly, I'm glad at the end of the day that this card came to 2 so we can actually deal with that going second, because I do not want to auto lose to cards like Anti-Spell Fragrance, Summon Limit, even Macrocosmos. It's just not feel good when your opponent flips it and you're like, well, yeah, we'll go to the next game, right? So that being said, without going on a tangent, cards that are not destructible by Pankratops, and by that I mean like chainable, right? Chainable and have a blanket effect, and then that kind of puts pressure on your opponent. You could also chain it to other things and get value out of that. So a card like Shared Ride might be something you can consider. This is a card that you can immediately chain to the effect of anything that adds, right? So you can chain it to the effect of a Ponix, for example. You can chain it to something weird like a Reinforcement of the Army. A Pot of Prosperity even adds because it excavates and then it adds a card, so technically it counts as adding. You chain the Shared Ride, you draw a card replacing the Shared Ride, which is already good, you know, 1-for-1 value, and then you put a blanket on the entire turn. So now if your opponent is adding cards constantly, you're going to have the ability to draw into more hand traps, cards like Nibiru that are very high impact, and then save you from dying. Because if you're drawing like 5 cards, the only real risk you have is literally losing the game right there on the spot if you get OTK'd. But as long as you're surviving the turn, if we have like 4 or 5 extra cards in our hand, chances are we're going to win the game, right, on the crackback. So drawing into your hand traps is especially important with cards like Share Ride, and I just love how this card allows you to get the value right away by chaining it. So if they go something like Pankratops, obviously just blind effect on your back row, you can also chain the Shared Ride, so you're getting a value there. And the problem with this card, I think, is sometimes it's a little low impact, because some decks can definitely play around adding. If they're only adding like 1 or 2 cards, then Shared Ride gets a lot worse. You're not going to be able to draw into your hand traps, and you're thinking, wow, this could have just been a floodgate like Anti-Spell. I would have been over and done with the game already. I would have won already, but, you know, instead it's Shared Ride, and I'm just sitting here saying like, oh, crap, it didn't really do anything for me. So that's just a caveat with this card. It's more one of those cards that are like, it's good when your opponent doesn't really expect it and they don't play around it. So like the first add that they do is like very high impact, like Pot of Prosperity or something, and they're like, oh crap, I have to continue adding with the rest of my engine to play, when I could have played that differently if I anticipated Shared Ride being a thing, right? So that's the problem with Shared Ride. I still think it's something that you guys can test. Those pros and cons, you guys can weigh them in the in your free time. Mistaken Arrest is the opposite of Shared Ride. This is until the next turn. After this card resolves, neither player can add cards from their deck to their hand except by drawing them, which means that you can immediately chain it. It's basically Drone Lockbird, but it's better going first because you can chain it to the effect of something adding, so you're getting a 1-for-1 trade out of that interaction, whereas Drone Lockbird, you're not getting any value because you're losing a -1. You're discarding the draw, you're spending 1 card, right? You're spending a resource, and your opponent is not really losing anything besides the intrinsic effect to add cards. They're still adding that first card, right? Whereas Mistaken Rest just shuts that down completely. If they go to something like Pot of Prosperity, you shut down the add, so you negate the prosperity for a 1-for-1, and then after the fact, they cannot add for the rest of the turn. The caveat, the drawback being that you also cannot add on your consecutive turn. So if you're playing a deck that actually relies on adding, maybe you're playing Fire King and something like, you need something to be added on the crackback to be able to play, then this card might backfire on you. But I think 9 times out of 10, if you're playing a deck that already like put a board on the table, it doesn't matter. Like your opponent's not playing. I have a board already. I have monsters. I'll just kill you with whatever cards I have in the hand, field, or the graveyard. I don't really need cards in my deck on the consecutive turn, right? So this card kind of has that value. Whereas Shared Ride allows you to draw into hand traps this card kind of cuts off your opponent, but you have to have a board with this type of card, because if you're already stopped by your opponent, if your opponent has like 3 hand traps and you're ending on a mediocre board that actually is going to be pushed into the grind game situation and you cannot add on your consecutive turn, then you might have an issue, right? Where Shed Ride kind of remedies that by allowing you to draw into more cards, more engine, yada yada. So yeah, these 2 cards are very chainable, which I like, over cards that are not typically chainable, like Anti-Spell Fragrance, which kind of has to deal with Pancratops. But again, Pancratops is only at 2 copies. The other thing is obviously Cosmic Cyclone deals with these floodgates as well. I forgot to mention earlier, but if you're activating an Anti-Spell Fragrance for a summon limit, if a good player held the Cosmic, they just chain it and they deal with it immediately. Whereas cards like Shared Ride and Mistaken Arrest, they just can't deal with that, right? So something to think about there. And then I actually have another card that I've been testing in and out of formats, and I know another commenter, another Squidly, commented it on the other Squidio, but Magic Deflector, this card is very much so powerful right now. It says for the rest of the turn, negate all equipped field, continuous, and quick play spell cards on the field, which means if your opponent is starting their play with a field spell, continuous spell, quick play spell, anything of the sort, you're getting a 1-for-1 trade by trading it right away for that card, and then they cannot use the card effects for the rest of the turn. So against Fire King specifically, what are we looking to deal with? Well, we can deal with the Fire King Sanctuary. We can also deal with the Fire King Island, negating that effect. It stays on the field, so what? They're not resolving the effect, right? You can also deal with cards that have been counter-sided in to deal with your back row, right? Like Cosmic Cyclone. You can negate a Cosmic Cyclone with Magic Deflector. That's so much value, right? If you're playing Fire King and you established your own island and you have something like an Appaloosa on the board and your opponent's like, hey, I have this Cosmic Cyclone, I'm going to deal with the Appaloosa by banishing the Fire King Island, triggering the mandatory effect to pop their field. Well, guess what? You can just brighten their day by flipping Magic Deflector, and if they're playing a deck that already uses field spells, which a lot of decks do, then those field spells are null and obsolete for the rest of the turn, as well as the quick play spell cards. Decks like Rescue Ace as well, you can shut off Emergency, which is a big deal, and then on top of that, you're shutting down the Cosmic Cyclone. Certain decks are still playing other cards like Enemy Controller. Even Super Polymerization, you can technically stop, okay? I don't mean like if they have it, obviously they can chain it, okay? But what if it's tucked away in their deck and they're hoping to draw it off of Pot of Prosperity or something out of the sort? Well, if we preemptively activated Magic Deflector earlier that turn to deal with something else, that Super Poly is not going to be played that turn because it's going to be negated by Magic Deflector, right? So although we can't respond to Super Poly, we can preemptively use Magic Deflection in response to something else, and if there's a Super Poly hidden away somewhere, it's not getting activated for that turn, right? So it's just like good things to know. Obviously, Enemy Controller, again, like people are going to be citing this in some certain decks just to dodge your targeting or removal and try and steal your stuff. And also, this is really troll, but the fact that this actually stops equipped spells is somewhat relevant, obviously against Infernovas, but also against Snatch Steal. Yes, Snatch Steal is at 1, guys, and some people are experimenting with this card. I don't think this card is that good. We have Change of Heart. No one's playing that. Come on. But, like, Snatch Steal, if anyone's playing this card in their deck, you can actually negate Snatch Steal now with Magic Deflector. So yeah, there are some niche scenarios where this card is really deflecting everything that's coming at you from your opponent. So I think this is the type of card that's very, very solid, and it's chainable. We talked about Shared Ride and Mistaken Arrest being chainable. And then, of course, this card is also settable off certain decks. Like if you're playing Labyrinth, you can set this card off of Lady, and then use the effect of Coup Clock or something to immediately trigger Magic Deflector. Like, yeah, you're not going to get Cosmic Cyclone, and you're stopping their field spells, continuous spells, equip spells, quick play spells. Like, this card just, I like this card a lot. So I'm going to test this card a little bit. I'm curious to hear what your guys' thoughts are on this card. It's kind of one of those toxic cards because it creates a blanket effect on the field, and I hate cards that do that, like Shifter, you know, like Troll Knockbird, Magic Deflector. All these cards are just sometimes annoying for the state of the game. But I mean, if you want to win and you won the die roll and you're going first in game 2, game 3, yeah, just like Magic Deflector. Come on, we're trying to win, right? Then there are other traps that, you know, have been tested and true over the time, like Solemn Judgment. This is a good card. Why are these cards good? Well, it's generically an Omni-Negate against anything that your opponent can summon on the table. But on top of that, more importantly, recently this card has been extremely good in Modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Why? Because it deals with side cards that your opponent have brought in, right? This is like an effective counter side measure to cards that your opponents are bringing in, like Evenly Matched if they're trying to banish your stuff. Even cards like Cosmic Cyclone if they're trying to banish, you know, your Fire King Island, your other floodgates, or whatever the heck they're trying to do. You can stop it with Solemn Judgment. And then the fact that this deals with a lot of things and a lot of matchups just just makes this card so versatile. What I don't like about this card is when you don't have a board and you pay half your life points and you're literally like, oh crap, I cannot live with 4,000 life points, so my opponent's gonna OTK me no matter what. Decks nowadays have a billion extenders, and if any of those are resolving, that's at least 4k damage. So yeah, that's the problem with this card. But again, it catches a lot of things, and the fact that it can trade off with powerful like interactions, like evenly matched, you know, your opponent's wasting their battle phase on top of getting the evenly matched negated. You get so much value out of that. And if you back this behind a board, you're generally in a very, very good position because this can negate anything. And I personally think that Solemn Judgment in normal summon is very effective after Phantom Nightmare comes out, because if you're actually judgmenting something like a normal summon Snake Eye Ash, sometimes that can be very huge. You're not only stopping the Ash, but you're stopping the monster on the body on the board. You're stopping the Ash effect from resolving, and you're stopping their normal summon, which is a big deal. Now, I'm not saying that's an auto win. There's still extenders like Bonfire and stuff that are coming out. Like, obviously, Dark Witch is still in the format. We still have Wanted. But again, I still think that Solemn Judgmenting in normal summon is very high impact. And then having the rest of your cards, like interactions, to deal with the rest of the extenders that your opponent has. And half the time that's going to be enough, because the normal summon is just such a big choke point right now for a lot of decks because they're very high impact. Like the normal summon in Yugioh has become insane in the recent years, and it's just like goes to show how valid Solemn Judgment is, being like a 20-year-old card that's still good because you can use it against counter sides as well as against like summons. So this card, I think, is decently good still. If you're playing a deck that is really afraid of cards like Evenly Matched especially, then this is something you can consider siding in. And then, of course, there is Solemn Strike. I was thinking about, you know, there's Solemn Strike. I don't really see an argument to run this over Judgment. I mean, you can technically argue that there are niche scenarios. If my opponent goes like Bonfire, add Populous reveal in the hand, I could technically use Strike. And, you know, you can't Judgment that because it's an effect in the field, but they get the Populous back in the scale, and it's like you're kind of negging at that point. You could obviously hold it for higher impact things, but I feel like there's so many monster extenders right now that Solemn Strike's just not it, because it loses that added advantage that Judgment has, where you can actually stop cards like Evenly Matched, or you stop side cards, right? So for me, I think Solemn Judgment is the biggest pick right now in terms of a card that can protect your board as well as stop your opponent. I don't think Strike is that valid right now, but in the future, I could see this card being good again. And then last but not least is actually not a spell or trap card, but a monster card, Artifact LANCEA. Why this card? Well, there are a lot of cards that actually banish nowadays that can actually hurt you. We talked about this card, Soul Release. Yes, this card actually banishing cards from our graveyard can hurt. So if you're playing a deck like Fire King and you're going first and you sided Lancea, you could chain Lancea to Soul Release, and that's a 1-for-1 trade. On top of that, you're also dealing with other cards that banish, like Evenly Matched. So yes, there are a lot of cards that actually banish right now that are being sided in. You deal with that. Potentially, they might have top decked a DD Crow and they want to use it proactively against something like a Garunix in your graveyard or a Promethean Princess in your graveyard coming back. So you can chain Lancea, and then guess what? They're not going to be able to resolve the Crow. Now, bear in mind that Lancea is only on your opponent's turn, so you can't actually use it on our own turn against Crow, but that's why I mentioned it being, you know, there's 6 cards that they top deck that they're going to be using proactively against our graveyard as they try to push past the board. Then Lancea comes in handy. Of course, all of the pot cards also banish as well. We're talking about cards like Pot of Desires, which just came back to 3, as well as Pot of Prosperity. They're banishing even Pot of Extravagance if Labyrinths are still playing this card. So those cards are all banishing. And then there are other cards that also banish in the format. Obviously, Fenrir, being able to banish your resources. You know, just if your opponent literally goes Special Summon Fenrir, battle phase, swing into one of your bigger creatures that are in attack position, hoping to banish it, and you chain Lancea, that's such a big blowout because they crash the Fenrir, it dies, and you're just there like, yes, this is so much value. So I was thinking, you know, this card might actually be decent. Obviously, there are not that many decks that actually do banish right now, but the card is good enough that it has added utility against decks like Rescue Ace, because even though Rescue Ace doesn't rely on banishing, they still have cards that that require banishing, right? Like their extenders, Preventer, as well as Turbulence. Yes, they can summon these off of Emergency, I get it, but the fact of the matter is, if they're wasting the Emergency on one of these cards, it means they're not going to be able to still use the effects in the hand, meaning they're not going to be able to link climb and actually deal with our board, right? So that's what I like about that card specifically. And of course, there are other cards that banish, like SP Little Knight. Very, very popular card. This card says banish a card from the field of the graveyard. If we're literally going to be using Lancea, I personally like holding it to chain to something, so I'm guaranteed to get the value. I don't really like shotgunning it, but you could have an argument to shotgun it in the grind game where you're like, okay, I don't want them to use Pot of Prosperity, and also I don't want to play into something like a Talents, because if you use Lancea during the main phase, then Talents becomes live. So there are niche scenarios where you want to just shotgun the Lancea, but generally speaking, I would rather have this as a surprise, chain it to something, get value, and also make sure my opponent plays into it without knowing that Lancea is in effect, and then they could somehow maybe play around it and survive for the turn, and then they keep the cards that they would have wasted in response to the Lancea, right? So that's my thoughts. I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts. What do you think is good going first right now? Are there any other cards that we missed? I'm sure there's some cards that have to be like blowouts as well that are decently good, right? And then what are your guys' thoughts on the cards that we kind of talked about so far? What do you think is the best one, and what do you think is the worst? Do you guys think Pankratops is that big of an impact, or am I just blowing it out of proportions? Let us know in the comments below. Other than that, we'll see you all in the next video. Thanks a lot for tuning in, guys. Bye-bye. Bye.